Hello, geometry scholars. Today we're going to be talking about something called an auxiliary line. Before we begin, please make sure you have your adding auxiliary lines in a proof worksheet, as well as something to write with, but you will not need a calculator today. If at any point the video goes too fast and you miss something, feel free to pause, rewind, and rewatch anything you may have missed. And with that, let's go ahead and get started on this idea of auxiliary lines. So when we're talking about auxiliary lines, we're actually talking about adding additional information to a diagram. Sometimes it is helpful to add some additional things to a diagram when we're writing these proofs. Sometimes taking a look at what's just there may not be enough, or maybe just adding something may make it easier to get to where we're going. But just like anything else we do in a proof, we've got to make sure that we do it in the right way. So we've got a couple of rules that are going to allow us to add these auxiliary lines properly. So the first thing, perhaps we need to add a point to our diagram, okay? So if we take a look here in our diagram, we've got a couple of lines, and then we've added just an intersection point. So in our statement, so in our proof, we have our statement column and our reasons column. The statement would just say add point A or draw point A. Our reason would say the intersection of two lines is exactly 1 point. This is one of the very first postulates we got at the very beginning of the year. So those early postulates actually are going to follow through with several of these reasons. Okay. The next thing, maybe we want to add just a line. So we want to connect some dots between some of the points that are already existing in our diagram. Okay. Our statement would read, just draw the auxiliary line and we'll name whatever it is. So typically though, when we draw auxiliary lines, we do make them dotted lines to show that they are additional from what was originally there, but it is okay to draw just a solid line as well. Now, our reason for just drawing a line is through any 2 points, there is exactly one line. Again, this was a very early postulate from earlier in the year. Now, the next few are going to be a little more specific. So instead of just adding any old point or any old line, we're going to add some specific types of points or specific types of lines. So the next one, maybe we want to add a midpoint. Okay, so we want to find the center of our point. Again, we just say we're going to add our midpoint D. Well, what allows us to do this, guys, is actually one that we talked about. We got it in our notes, but we never really used it. This one is actually the ruler postulate. You measure a line or a segment with a ruler. So we use a ruler to find its midpoint. Okay, the ruler postulate was the one that just allowed us to create our own measuring system. Okay, so now the next one, let's add an angle bisector. Well, if we use the ruler postulate to add a midpoint, what do you think we need to use to add a bisector? Well, we measure a segment with a ruler. We measure an angle with a protractor. Again, this is another one we talked about, but never really used. Here's where it comes into play. So if you want to add a segment or an angle bisector, you're going to use the protractor postulate. The next two are a little more recent. We're not going quite back as far as we did for the other postulates here. But again, they were ones that we kind of glazed over, but we didn't really use them. So if we wanted to draw a perpendicular line, okay, so we want to add a line that's perpendicular to some other line on our page. This one is going to be the perpendicular postulate. This is the one that said through a point, not on a line. So through a point that was not on our line down here, we're going to have exactly one line that's perpendicular to our given line that also goes through that point. So there's a guarantee that we can draw a perpendicular line pretty much anywhere. Okay. The last one in our set, maybe we want to add a parallel line. We've got all of these rules dealing with parallel lines, so having some additional parallels could be beneficial. So, well, let's think about it. To add a perpendicular line, we need the perpendicular postulate. So to add a parallel line, we'll use our parallel postulate. Okay, this one was pretty similar. This one said through a point, not on a line. So here's our line down here. We will have exactly one line parallel to our given line that goes through that original point. Okay. Now on the back of this page, there's a little bit more information. You do have to be careful when you try combining any of these rules. Any one of them is fine at any time, but trying to combine them could present some errors. For example, if you wanted to add a perpendicular bisector to your page, well, you have to use two things. You've got to use the ruler postulate, that's the midpoint, the bisector part, and you've got to use the perpendicular postulate, so you get the perpendicular portion. The problem arises in that students tend to make assumptions. They'll look at a diagram like this. Okay, they'll look at that diagram and they'll think, oh, well, if I want to add a perpendicular bisector, I'll just draw things a little bit more straight. I'll just connect my dots. Well, it's not that simple. You can guarantee that there will be a line between points C and D. You can guarantee that D can be the midpoint, but you can't guarantee that this line you've drawn is definitely perpendicular. Okay, that line could be very much skewed. Okay, so to correctly do it, you'd want to take a look at this. You'd have to add an additional point up at the peak of your triangle here. Okay, because you can't guarantee that this perpendicular line will necessarily intersect this vertex up here. Okay, so the right-hand side is what you do not want to do. This is the incorrect assumption. You do not want to make the assumption that these two things can be combined. Okay, so do be careful with that. All right, folks, it's time for you to try a few. At the bottom of the page here, it's going to ask you to draw the indicated auxiliary, and it asks you to give a reason for that auxiliary line. So at this time, you need to try each one of these, and when you are done, check your work with the answer key. Once you're finished with that, you are done with your video for today.